Hello and welcome to Pocket Size Apologetics. Sorry about the little delay in getting things started here. When everything falls on you, sometimes I'm trying to get you ever one of those times where I also post things on our social media accounts, and I was trying to make sure the links went out at the last minute. And of course, for Instagram, the notification to post it comes to my phone. And as soon as I'm trying to post it onto my phone, I get like all these notifications start popping up, and the way that the particular app that I use to post it is something called Buffer. It's like the buttons I need to click to get it to post are right there at the top of the screen, and so I'm sitting here trying to click to post, and then some notification pops up. So and so commented on whatever. It's like, and it's blocking where I need to post. It's like swipe that out of the way, and it's very frustrating. But we're good. We're going. We're live. Thank you very much for joining us again today for Pocket Size Apologetics. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ken Coughlin. I am, as far as my job here at Trinity, one of my titles is the social media director, which means that I am the video guy. I oversee all of right now it's like almost all live streaming, isn't it? Because of, everybody's at home with coronavirus and all that. I am also a Christian apologist. My background is I've spent about over 2 decades studying what's called Christian apologetics. And Christian apologetics, for those of you that are joining us for the first time and may not know, it's just it's basically the defense of the truth of the Christian faith. It's being prepared to answer the questions that non-believers may have as far as reasons why they don't believe, obstacles they put up to belief. So I've been doing that for about 2 decades now. I've been a lawyer, or was a lawyer, for the past 21 years. I left private practice back in January and now work here for the church and the school full time. And I finally decided after 2 decades of studying the subject that maybe I'd try to actually get a formalized degree in it. So I'm actually a little over halfway through my master's at Luther Rice Seminary in Christian apologetics as well. So that's who I am, for those of you that don't know me. But a little bit about what this program is. Again, it's since we've all been kind of confined to our homes with a lot of people confined to their homes with the coronavirus, it's kind of taken on a new shape, a new form. It used to be that this was a pre-taped thing in front of a green screen, and it was about a 4 to 5 minute video that kind of covered one little topic each time. But that just, especially with my schedule, having to handle oversee all the different video production elements that we're doing now, that we're doing a lot more on the channel, since that's people are stuck in their homes. That's how we reach them. That it just wasn't feasible for me to keep doing that format. And so it kind of evolved into this live streaming format, which allows the opportunity, if any of you are watching and you live and you have any questions, you can put them in the live chat. You can ask them to me as we go through. I'd be more than happy to try to answer them here live on the air. I got the chat sitting right here next to me, so I should be able to see your comments as they pop up. Just try to keep it polite and respectful. That's all I ask. I don't care if you're a believer or if you're a non-believer. Ask your questions, pose them. I'd be happy to try to answer them. Now, to give you an idea a little bit about what this show is like now, what we still try to do, we still try to stay true to the name. The name of the show is obviously Pocket Size Apologetics. What you're going to see in a lot of these programs that are online, a lot of the apologetics programs, they understand, and I understand, that most of the people who are going to be watching a show like this are not formally trained in apologetics. You're the people sitting in the pews, so to speak, but maybe you have some questions of your own. Maybe you want some more information about how to answer questions that some of your friends or coworkers or whatever are asking. And understanding that, a lot of what we talk about in apologetics can go right over your head if you're not trained, whether it be in philosophy, science, scientific disciplines, things like that. And I get that. Now, the compromise that a lot of these online YouTube programs that focus on apologetics strike is they keep it simple, they keep it general. All right, so they're going to give you, if you saw a video out there on the moral argument for the existence of God, which is what we're going to be talking about today, you might find a video that's, anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes long, and it's going to give you a very general overview of what the moral argument is. But it's not going to dive too deep because the word's going to go over your head, and it's going to take a whole lot longer. This program is a little bit in contrast to that. I do try to keep it narrowly focused, but I do like to dive deeper. I want to give you a deeper understanding of what these various evidences and arguments are. I'm very much aware, though, that in doing that, it could get a little bit overwhelming and it could get over your head. And so the compromise that we strike is I try to keep it very narrowly focused. So yes, we're going to dive deeper, but we're just going to tackle one little pocket-sized tidbit at a time. Now, what that means as a practical matter is I don't do just one video on the moral argument for the existence of God, because I don't want it to be overwhelming. I want to dive deeper, but I don't want to do a 2.5, 3-hour video on every single, going to every single little aspect of it in order to give you a deeper understanding. I want you to be able to have one topic, and we talk about one minor, small little tidbit part of it, and you can ruminate on that for a week, and then come back the following week, and we'll take the next little snippet-sized, pocket-sized aspect of it. But in the end, if you do watch these videos all the way through, what you'll end up with is a deeper understanding of the intricacies of all these different evidences and arguments than you would get just by watching a 10-minute summary video, all right? But hopefully you will be able to follow it. You're not going to get lost because we are going to take it one small step at a time. And like I said, that's also the advantage if you can watch this. Right now we're Fridays at noon. I think we're going to be that way for a while. If you can watch it live, then tune in live and ask questions as we go along. I'm happy to answer them for you. All right, so I do want to, this is our second week now talking about the moral argument for the existence of God. We did talk about it last week. I do encourage people to go back. We were talking about 25, 30 minutes last week about it. I do encourage, if you missed that, to go back and watch that one. But I do want to give a really quick summary here to kind of bring you up to speed so you're not completely lost as we go into today. So last week what we talked about is we did talk about defining what the moral argument is. And this is what we talked about, all right? I broke down the moral argument for the existence of God into premises and a conclusion, all right? And I did it like this. I said, premise number one, if a personal God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Premise two, objective moral values do exist. And conclusion, therefore, a personal God exists. So don't worry if that seems kind of over your head and kind of overwhelming right now. We're going to break it down. And like I said, I'd encourage you to go back and watch last week's too to get a better understanding of what all those mean. But what we did primarily last week is we talked about the difference between what are called moral values and moral duties, all right? And I said that a value is basically the content of a moral principle. What is love, for example? What does that mean? All right, and where can we look, what source, if any, can we look to determine if an act is a loving act or not? All right. Now, in contrast to that, we said a moral duty is something that imposes an obligation upon us to act in a certain way. All right, for example, with the concept of love, a duty would impose an obligation upon us to act in a loving manner. And it's an important distinction to keep in mind because just because this concept of love exists, all right, and there is, even if we could define it and say there is something out there called love, why does that mean we have to behave that way? What is it that imposes an obligation upon us to be loving? All right, so that's the distinction, an important one, but a kind of a nitpicky one, but an important one between a moral value and a moral duty. And somebody's calling me. I can't answer my phone right now. I'm live on YouTube. All right. And finally, one of the other things we talked about last week is we talked about how Christianity and the God of Christianity can ground both moral values and moral duties on an objective basis. In other words, if Christianity is true, then moral values can be real. And we can point to somewhere where they have their source. And the same is true for moral duties, both moral values and moral duties. And we said that moral values can find their source in God's character. Just like you have a character, I have a character, God has a character. Of course, God's character is perfect, ours isn't. And so when we say an act is loving, whether we realize we're saying this or not, what we're really doing is we're saying that it mirrors or resembles that character trait in God. All right, now obviously not perfectly, but that's what we're approaching, that's what we're getting to. And as for duties, what we talked about last week is moral duties need to be grounded in a person. You don't owe a moral duty to a rock. You owe a moral duty to people, all right? And so for there to be such a thing as objective moral duties that we owe to other people, the source of that needs to be a person. All right. And of course, for Christianity, this is no problem because we say that we owe our ultimate moral duty to God, and all other moral duties are kind of derived from that. And so moral duties do have a source in a person. Actually, God is three persons, right? Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But because there's a personal source, moral duties can make sense. All right. That is the very quick rundown of what we spent like half an hour talking about last week. If that all went over the head, please go back, look last week, and we'll take it obviously a little bit slower then. All right. So what we've done so far is we've shown how if the Christian God is real, then objective moral values and duties can exist. All right. Now, as a reminder of what that difference means, what's the difference between saying that morality is objective versus saying it is subjective? All right. In order to illustrate that, I want to kind of revisit the illustration, the example that I gave last week. And it goes like this. All right. So let's pretend that good old Steve is walking down the street. He's whistling away. It's dry in here. I can't whistle right now. But anyway, he's whistling away, having a happy, good old time. And then all of a sudden, out of the alleyway jumps Steve. All of a sudden, bam! Steve comes out, punches Joe in the face. Or the other way around. Joe comes out and punches Steve in the face. I always get my people mixed up. Steve's walking. Joe's jumping out of the alley. Joe punches Steve in the face. Steve falls to the ground. He gets up. And the first thing he says, of course, after saying, ow, is I'm going to sue. All right, that's what we always see in today's society, right? I'm going to sue. All right, you punched me. That's assault. That's legally wrong by the legal rules of our government. All right, and so Steve tells Joe, I'm going to sue you for every cent that you're worth. And Joe says, well, you can try, but you're not going to get anywhere because the civil law, meaning the government law, is on my side here. All right. I think I was legally perfectly allowed and permitted to jump out of the alley and just punch whoever the heck I wanted to do it to. All right, so Joe says I was legally right. Steve says, no, you were legally wrong. Joe says I was legally right. Steve says you were legally wrong. They go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. The question is, they obviously each have their own opinions as far as what the governmental law says. Is there a way to resolve that dispute? Well, of course there is. All right, there's a number of ways they could resolve that dispute. They could go see a lawyer. All right, they could go to court and have a judge decide. They can open up the law book, and the law book is going to say, sorry, Joe, I don't care what you think in your personal opinion. The law is you can't just come jumping out of alleys and punching random people. All right, so congratulations, Steve. You're going to be able to successfully sue Joe for any damages that you have. All right, so that is the difference between illustrates the difference between a subjective law and an objective law. If all that it was their personal opinions, all right, if there was no governmental law book above them they could appeal to, then we would call that subjective. And let me illustrate this from a moral standpoint as well. Take that exact same scenario, but now put it in the moral context. All right, now when Joe comes out and punches Steve, all right, instead of Steve saying, I think you were legally wrong according to the civil governmental law, I think you were morally wrong. I think what you did to me was a moral wrong act to do. And Joe says, no, I think I was morally right. And Steve says, no, I think I was morally wrong. You were morally wrong. And Joe says, nope, morally right. Steve says, nope, morally wrong. They clearly each have their opinions, just like in the governmental law example. They each have their opinions as far as what the morally right and wrong thing are in this scenario. The question is there anything above them, just like we had that civil law book they could consult, is there anything above them that ultimately determines who's right and who's wrong, or are all we're left with is their opinions? All right. If all we have are their opinions and there is nothing above them, then that's what we call subjective morality. The people involved here are the subjects. All right. Joe and Steve are the subjects of our scenario. All right. If ultimately that's where the top level where morality can lie is in those subjects, then we call that subjective morality. Their opinions are all there is. All right. However, if there is something above them that could determine whether the act itself is morally right or wrong. In other words, it doesn't matter what those subjects believe. The act is either morally right in and of itself or it's morally wrong in and of itself. Then that act is what we call the object. All right. And so in that case, if the act itself determines whether or not something is morally right or wrong, regardless of what personal opinion is, then that's what we call objective morality, because the highest source of morality is the object itself. All right. It's what determines. Now, what we talked about last week is I did say that, yes, as far as Christianity is concerned, objective morality can be real and it can find its source in God. And that's what I was talking about earlier. All right. So if morality is grounded in God, it's objective. If it finds its source in only in the people, in their personal opinions, then it's subjective. All right. For objective, it doesn't matter whether or not we personally believe something is morally right or wrong. There is a right answer to whether or not something is morally right or wrong. But what's important here is to realize that the premise one of the moral argument says more than just God is a possible explanation for objective morality. All right. If you look carefully at premise one of the moral argument, it says if a personal God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. In other words, if or really should say moral values or duties do not exist. I think I did last week. I think I got a typo on this one. But the point is that what the moral argument is saying is God is the only way for this to be true. If God doesn't exist, all morality can ever be is subjective opinion. All right, it's at the subjective level. It's you think one thing, the other person thinks another thing, and ultimately there's nothing above you to judge between you. Okay, so that's an important distinction. I haven't demonstrated all of that yet. All I've done so far is to show that God is an adequate explanation for objective morality. I haven't gone so far yet to show that no other explanation will work. All right. And next week I'm going to do that. All right. Next week I'm going to go into some of the other attempts that folks have made to try to come up with some type of objective source for morality that applies to everybody, something above us that's not just personal opinion. All right, but what I want to do this week is two things. First, before we get there, is I want to talk a little bit about a common misunderstanding that is lodged against the moral argument for the existence of God. And after responding to that common misunderstanding, I also want to talk about why it matters. Why does it matter whether morality is objective or subjective? What difference does it make? And how do we know it's objective? I mean, I'm sitting here saying that, yes, there is this standard above us, but how do we know that? How do we know that it's nothing more than just personal opinion? So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the misunderstanding. This is a misunderstanding. It's a red herring that is often lodged by skeptics, by atheists, against a moral argument, and it completely misses the point, and we're going to talk about why. And the misunderstanding goes like this. You will talk to some atheists, and they will say, atheists are perfectly capable of behaving in a moral manner and having a good personal moral code without believing in God. Therefore, God is not necessary for me to behave in a moral manner, and so the moral argument doesn't show anything at all. It's useless. That's what the objection is. So let's see if this is true, first of all. And I have a nice little illustration here. And what we see on the screen is we're going to call this gentleman Joe Atheist. All right, so Joe Atheist is walking along the street around his neighborhood because he's allowed to right now. You can still get out and exercise, okay, and walk your pets and all that. You just, no non-essential travel, but you're allowed to exercise, at least here in Maryland. So Joe Atheist is walking around his block, and lo and behold, he comes across a little puppy. And there's this puppy hiding in the grass, and you can see from our little illustration here with the puppy, he's got his leash in his mouth, so clearly he's broken away from his owner at some point or another. We have a lost puppy. So what does Joe Atheist do with this lost puppy? Well, he looks at the dog's collar. Lo and behold, it has the owner's contact information on there. And so Joe Atheist contacts the owner and sure enough, returns the lost puppy to its proper owner. Yay, Joe Atheist. Congratulations. This is proof positive that atheists can behave in a moral manner, and therefore we don't need this moral argument. Is that correct? Well, it's correct that atheists can believe and have a good moral code and behave in a moral manner without believing in God, but it does not disprove the moral argument. And the reason for that is it completely misses the point of the moral argument. The moral argument is not about whether or not we can behave in a moral manner. It's not even about what we personally believe is morally right or wrong. The moral argument is about where does morality come from? Ultimately, where does it come from? So this objection that's raised by the atheist is talking about a different subject entirely. It's talking about whether an individual person can have a personal moral code that's a good one without believing in God. And I agree, sure they can. Atheists can do good moral things, but that doesn't answer the question of where morality comes from. What's its ultimate source? Is there an ultimate source, or is that personal opinion all there is? So it's talking apples and oranges, all right? Next thing I want to talk about is why does it matter? All right, why does it matter whether morality is objective or subjective? Does it make a lick of a difference? All right, and ultimately, how do we know? How do we even know that morality is objective versus subjective? How do we know it's not just a matter of personal opinions? Now, when getting into this, a lot of people who believe in subjective morality will say that I've misrepresented it several times throughout this presentation. Because what I've said a number of times is I've talked about it as if subjective morality is an individual thing. All right, where you have your personal opinion, I have my personal opinion, and that's all there is. Morality is just, everybody has their own individual morality, and so all there is, and ethical relativists just believe that everybody has their own personal moral system. And what a lot of people believe in subject morality will say, no, that's not what they believe. They do believe in something that's higher above the individual person, and that is culture. what they'll argue is that morality isn't based upon just what just this one person believes or just this other person believes. Rather, it's based upon what the larger culture says, and that we have an obligation to obey our larger cultural norms. It's wrong, you'll hear this a lot of times, it's wrong for a person from one culture to judge the moral values of a person from another culture, right? But we should all abide by the moral rules that our particular culture imposes upon us, what our particular culture says are right and wrong. This concept is what is called ethical relativism, all right? Ethical meaning morals, relative is meaning it's all relative, and relative in this case to the culture, to what your cultural norms say. Now, in the end, I think this attempted distinction, this attempt to make it something broader, it's not just an individual, what's in the individual's mind, it's what's in the culture as a whole, it's a false distinction. It falls apart, it collapses. But I'll explain why in a few minutes. I'm not going to get to that just yet. The answer is, in short, it all still boils down to what an individual thinks. You can't try to expand morality to this cultural norm. It still ends up being just what the individual thinks. But first, what I want to do is I want to talk about, honestly, how people defend ethical relativism. People who believe that there is nothing ultimately above us that transcends all people that determines what is morally right or morally wrong, that all ethics are what basically groups or cultures come up with. How do they defend that point? Well, a couple ways. One way that people will defend that is they will point out how cultures inevitably impact what you think, morally speaking. All right, your moral opinions are in some way, shape, or form influenced by the culture to which you belong. Just like our culture determines what language we speak, it allegedly also influences what morality we accept. All right, and this, of course, is absolutely true. All right, we can concede that point. It is absolutely true that we are all influenced by our culture, all right, even in the realm of morality. But it also misses the point, all right? It confuses two different things. And I'm going to show you, don't be intimidated by this, I'm going to show you the fancy, scholarly terms for them. We'll get to what they mean in a minute. It confuses two different things, what's called ontology and what's called epistemology, all right? Ontology refers to the truth of something, all right? For example, it is true that human beings, at least those who don't suffer from some kind of color blindness or regular blindness, perceive the sky as blue. All right, we look up at the sky, it looks blue. All right, that is an ontological truth. All right, epistemology, however, refers to what we believe and how we arrive at our beliefs. All right, these are different questions. Here's how you illustrate this. I can believe that people perceive the sky as being blue. And so I have the correct ontological belief. That is the truth of the matter. My belief matches up with what the truth of the matter is. But let's pretend that I arrived at that belief because I believe that above the sky there are crystal clear blue oceans, just like the oceans that are here on Earth. And there are fish and whales and all sorts of sea creatures swimming through that ocean up in the sky. It's just it's so far away we can't see them. We just see the surface of the sea. I have arrived at the correct ontological conclusion, but the manner in which I've arrived at it, all right, is questionable to say the least, all right? So my epistemological process, the process by which I arrived at my beliefs, is a separate thing from what I believe is actually true or not. All right. I can also have a flawed epistemological process and come to the belief that the moon is made of cheese. All right, and that would be an example where I have the wrong ontological belief. All right, and so because there ultimately is a true and a false answer to these things. So that's the difference between ontology, what is true, and epistemology, what do we believe, or how did we arrive at our beliefs, all right? And the ethical relativist who's making this argument about how cultures inevitably influence our moral codes is confusing the two, all right? When we talk about the influence that a culture has upon our personal moral beliefs, we're talking about epistemology. We're talking about how people came to believe what they came to believe when it comes to the realms of morality, all right? But the moral argument's not talking about epistemology. It's talking about ontology. It's talking about what's ultimately the truth about morality, all right? Is it true that our individual moral beliefs are all there is? There is nothing above us. Or is it true that there's something greater, There's something above us that we're all subject to that determines what is actually right and what is actually wrong, regardless of what we personally believe. So this first defense of ethical relativism misses the point. All right, it confuses ontology and epistemology. Now, in response to this point, many ethical relativists will argue that, but hey, look around the world. All right, if you look around the world, you're going to notice that moral codes differ from culture to culture, sometimes quite drastically. And so because everybody has their own different moral rules, every culture has their own different moral rules, there can't be something, it's not reasonable to believe that there is something transcendent, something above them all that's actually determining what is right and what is wrong. Again, this argument for ethical relativism misses the point, all right? The fact that different people around the world arrive at different moral conclusions is still talking about epistemology. It's not talking about, it doesn't mean that they're actually arriving, each of those conclusions they're arriving at is equally worthy of respect, all right, that is equally true, all right, has the same level of authority as any one other. I mean, if we were to take this ethical relativist argument at face value, we would have to be prepared to say that the moral values that were held by those in authority in Nazi Germany are just as legitimate as the moral values of anybody else. That ultimately there's no standard above us by which we can say, no, those moral values that were espoused in Nazi Germany were wrong, and they were objectively wrong, all right? Not just a matter of personal opinion. It's not that I have my personal preference and I think one thing morally, they thought something else morally. I really can't say, judge between those two. We try to say, no, we can judge between those two, and their beliefs were actually wrong. All right. And here's the other thing, and this is kind of a neat thought if you think about it. Ethical relativists, there's no such thing as an ethical relativist. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are philosophers, you're going to find a lot of people on YouTube or Facebook, social media that will claim to be ethical relativists. But ultimately they're not. They talk a good game, but when the chips are down, they're not really an ethical relativist. You don't believe me? Spend 10 minutes on Facebook. You cannot throw a proverbial stick without hitting somebody who's making some kind of moral judgment about somebody else. All right. The moment we do that, the moment someone makes a moral judgment about something someone else has done, they're assuming that there's an objective standard to morality. They're assuming that there's some standard they're appealing to, that there's something above us that determines what is actually morally right and what's actually morally wrong. And my moral opinion, meaning the person who's doing the judging, my moral opinion is in line with that objective standard. Your moral opinion is not in line with that objective moral standard. And so I have the right to tell you that you're wrong. All right? Every time one person tells another person they're wrong, they're assuming objective morality. They're assuming there's a standard above us that determines who is right and who is wrong, that there is a right answer. All right? It gets back to our example of Joe punching Steve on the street, right? When I say that you did something morally wrong, I'm not just making a statement of personal preference. See, if ethical relativism were true, all right, then when Joe and Steve are having a disagreement about, I think you were morally wrong to punch me, you think you were morally right to punch me, blah, 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 really all they're doing is they're expressing their matters of personal preference, all right? And that's not the way we engage in conversations that deal with moral judgments, is it? Again, look on Facebook, look on Twitter, any kind of social media. People get all really high and mighty in their moral opinions, don't they? Because they assume that there is a moral standard above them that they're appealing to. If ethical relativism were true, and if people really believed it, then essentially what that would be saying is, I'm getting angry at you because you have a different preference than I do. To boil it down to something that's even easier to understand, ethical relativism is the same as saying, I'm getting angry at you because you like a different flavor of ice cream than I do. If all morality is preferences, then there is no difference between a moral opinion and an opinion on what the best flavor of ice cream is. They're the same thing. It's all a matter of personal opinion. Ask yourself the next time you see someone on social media lambasting someone else if that's really the attitude they're taking. Are they really just saying, your opinion's different from mine, but we really don't have any way to judge between them? No, they are judging between them. And that's what I get to. Everybody ultimately believes in objective morality, whether they openly acknowledge it or not. There's another problem with people claiming that, that this argument that the ethical relativists will make, with our claim that because different cultures have different moral values, then there can't be a standard above us. It's not reasonable to believe that there's a standard above us when everybody's arriving at different conclusions. They're just wrong. I mean, that's just not an accurate description of what we see around the world. On a fundamental level, it's not true. All right. Now, if you were to take just a surface look at different moral codes from different cultures around the country, to you on the surface, it may look like they are saying some very, very different things. All right. But if you take the time to dig deeper and you look underneath the surface, what you're going to find is that there are general moral principles that everybody agrees about. All right. In his book, The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis pointed out that all cultures have moral rules in favor of things like benevolence, taking care of your elders, honesty, duties to children, mercy, etc. Every culture around the world has these values. Now, what differs from culture to culture is how these general rules play out in specific contexts. In other words, depending on the culture I belong to, what it means for an act to be beneficent might look different than what it does in a different culture. All right. So the variations in cultures can impact what actions are considered to be benevolent, for example, but they all still believe in benevolence as a general principle. All right. They all have that in common. So it's just fundamentally not true that we have these widely varying different moral cultures around the world. We do all seem to agree on these foundational principles, which begs the question of why. Why do we all have this foundation? Well, if there is an object of morality that we all have some kind of contact with, then that would explain it, wouldn't it? Now, the last thing I want to point out today is something I mentioned earlier that I was going to get back to, and that is why this whole cultural model collapses anyway. In other words, in the end, there is no such thing as a cultural morality. Ethical relativists who try to base their morality, their moral system in cultures, it's because they recognize that if all morality is personal opinion, we're left with chaos. All right, no one person can tell any one other person and have any foundation for telling any other person that their moral belief is wrong. The morals of Jeffrey Dahmer are the same as those of Mother Teresa. An interesting example, by the way, talking about cultures. You get to Indian cultures, they believed that a lot of what Mother Teresa was doing was wrong because of their caste system, but they still believed in a general law of benevolence. They just didn't think that her acts were benevolent because of the way their culture played out that general principle, but they still had the same moral principle. Sorry, that's a side note. But what I'm arguing here is that when these ethical relativists try to say that we still have this obligation to obey what our cultural norms are, that's because they recognize that we're left with chaos if it's all a matter of personal opinion. They really want there to be something higher than that. But ultimately, without God, there is nothing higher than that. And cultural ethics ends up collapsing to individual ethics anyway. Here's why. If we are told that we are supposed to obey the ethical principles of our culture, there's a very simple question in response to that. Which one? Which culture? The fact of the matter is, all of us belong to multiple cultures, all right? Society is filled with pockets, and those pockets all have their own cultural norms. All right? And we, throughout our lives, are going to belong to several different pockets. You have your work pocket, your friend's pocket, your church pocket. I mean, for 21 years, I was a practicing attorney. All right? Retired from the private practice of law in January. Well, the norm, or the pocket, the culture of the legal profession, that has its own moral and cultural norms to it. All right? I was also a Christian that whole time. And I had my various different churches that I attended. Well, my church had its own culture as well. And I got news for you, which is probably going to be a surprise to nobody. The moral norms of the legal profession didn't always match up with the moral norms of my church. And so the question arises for the cultural relativist, when you say I'm supposed to obey the moral norms of my culture, which culture are you talking about? I mean, as Christians, obviously, we'd say you obey God, right? But that's different. I'm talking about from a cultural relativist perspective, or an ethical relativist perspective, who says that you're supposed to obey what dictates is the moral norms of your culture. There is no one culture that people belong to. It's not so neatly separated, all right? Every single one of us is an individual. And we belong to different minor pockets, different subcultures, whatever you want to call them. And all of those combine to influence us, and they do influence us. But everybody's influence is going to be different because everybody belongs to different pockets. All right. So ultimately, if you try to say that we can look to our cultures to determine what's morally acceptable and what's not morally acceptable, it still ends up coming down to an individual basis, because everybody's individual beliefs are going to be shaped differently based on which cultures they belong to. And so we're still left with this idea that if there's nothing above us, if there is no God, then morality is just individual opinions. What you believe is what you believe, what I believe is what I believe, and there's no standard to judge between the two of us. All right? So what I want to do and what I like to do at the end of these things, I like to wrap things up. All right? And so in closing, I do want to kind of look back at the moral argument here and see what it was in summary fashion, what we've established today. All right, so the moral argument said this. It said, premise one, if a personal God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise two, objective moral values and duties do exist. And conclusion, therefore, a personal God exists. All right, now primarily what I've defended here today is premise two. All right, objective moral values and duties do exist. Moral relativism doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense as a practical matter, and it's also not what any of us actually believe when the chips are down, or no matter what we say on the outside. If you don't believe me, watch how a moral relativist responds if someone steals their wallet. All right? I guarantee you they're not going to just brush it off and say, well, I guess according to their moral code, stealing's okay, so they can have all my money and credit cards. No, they're going to act like something objectively wrong was done to them. All right? So for the past 2 weeks, I've shown how Christianity can support objective moral values and duties. This week, I've defended how we can know that objective moral values and duties do in fact exist. So next week, what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to revisit premise one again. All right, I've shown that God's existence can explain objective morality. I've shown that morality is in fact objective, it's not subjective. But I still need to show that nothing else other than God can explain objective morality. Is it possible, in other words, that there is some way objective morality could exist without God? Is there some other possible moral standard that could exist above us other than God? You should also already be seeing, if you were paying attention last week at the beginning of this week's class, where some of the problems lie in that. We already talked about how in order for moral duties to make any sense, they have to be grounded in a person. And so obviously you're going to have a problem with any theory that doesn't involve a person as being the source of those moral duties. But we'll get more into that next week. Once you say it's a person, then you're left with God. You're right back where we started with. But next week, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some of the other options that have been proposed as an attempt to explain objective morality without God, and we're going to see if any of them hold up. All right? If you have any questions, you can put them in the comments section. Even after, if you're watching this, you're not watching this live, put them in the comments section, and I will try to take a look at that between this week and next week. And if there are any questions in the comment section, I can pick them up at the beginning of next week's episode. All right? Thank you all very much for watching. I hope this was somewhat educational and not too much. I know we kind of tackled a little bit more today than we normally do, but we'll try to keep it a little bit shorter again next week. All right? So next Friday, 12 noon, Pocket Size Apologetics. Thank you very much for joining me, everybody. God bless.